how I animated a transitional montage. Although this isn't a tutorial, I will link to any videos that help me as well as any other ones that are relevant to what I'm talking about in the description as well as in the card links. This will be fairly in depth, but I'm not going to explain everything that I did, rather focus on why I did it and how I tried to use both the throwaway scenes transition to add to the story of the film, giving accurate details and emphasizing the themes of the film. In a video recently, I showed a time lapse of the modeling and texturing of the girl character in the sequence, but I didn't talk about why I chose that design at all. The concept of this girl was to very cross between a hippie and steampunk, the idea being that she grew up in a dump and uses the things around her that to have been discarded to create things. This is in her costume design in particular, with asymmetry being a core design concept, as well as adding small details such as the bottle cap earring and a single yellow croc to show her resourcefulness. This then translated into her method of transport. I originally had the idea of her riding a tricycle, but then happened upon recumbent bikes which are like reverse tricycles and thought that they looked more interesting. Yeah. Then when I was designing the bike, I used a technique called kit bashing, which is where you use bits and pieces of other models to create a mismatched new model. In this case, I took bits of other models of bikes, tires and a gaming chair to create the bike and then tied it all together with some sticks. This gave the bike a DIY look that adds to the girl's character and also plays into one of the key themes of the film, which is things. Beauty and damaged and discarded things. I also wanted the bike to fly, so I made the frame with sticks and modeled the wings. I then added a armature to I wouldn't to animate and used a driver to automatically make the wheel spin when the bike moved. With the main assets created, I began the first shot. I would already found the song that I wanted to use for this sequence, a cover of House of the Rising Sun. So I brought the section that I wanted into Fincy Resolve and then marked out of the key beats of the song so I could place certain movements in the right times in the right music. Then on to animation. To make the bike move, I use a generator modifier on the main bike control empty to make it go forward at a steady rate. I then began working on the camera move so that I wouldn't have to animate anything not being seen. I had this idea of a tracking shot that pulls out of a close-up of the balloon and into the wire to show the vehicle in full. I soon decided to change this to a zoom out. However, to make it more realistic camera move, a zoom would allow me to emphasize the speed of the moment with the trees washing past the camera. I added some noise modifiers to the rotation and location of the camera, as well as using the camera shake if I had on to create some fairly realistic camera motion while still keeping the balloon in frame. I then moved on to texturing the ground. And I want to put a quick side note in here that you may not notice that I don't particularly conventional or linear way when creating a shot. This is mostly because I want to be excited on the thing that I'm working on, so I just work on whatever part of the shot I feel like doing at the time rather than following a specific workflow. I find that it keeps me more creative, but I understand that it is not always recommended. Anyway, I used ground texture from H2I Heaven for the floor and transition it into a dirt texture. This is to show the move away from the civilization. It's a small touch, but final shot. I do this using two gradient maps and a noise texture to mix the shaders together. I then bring in a HDRI to do some lighting and the work as a background. Continuing with the background, I use the ANT landscape add-on to generate mountains for the background and use geometry nodes to spread across them to give them a painlily feel. I use the object info on color ramp node to randomize the color of the strokes and then use the random value geometry node to randomize size and rotation. I then began playing with the forehand to show the speed of the bike as well as a storytelling device to show the transition to nature. With this in mind, I ended up being with painting and concrete buildings behind the bike with them slowly transitioned into trees. In the foreground and midground, I then needed to think of a way to transition into the next shot, so I used a particular system to have falling leaves be below that could wipe in the front of the lens and work as a transition. The second shot is very similar to the first, and I could have made it a single shot, but the leaf wiping across the lens allowed me to split it into two shots, which means that I could delete anything from the first shot isn't needed for the second, such as the mountains and the buildings. This kept my project running smoothly. For the second shot, I wanted to focus the action of the girl in turning to mechanism to open the wings. I also wanted to keep the energy high. I went back to my music to see when the action of the turning of the stick should occur to line up with the song. That happened to be higher note on the played about the right time. I made note of what frame that note began on and had my character start to turn her hand at the frame. To emphasize the movement, I added a zoom and the rotation of the camera. I also added a small character detail of how she grips the stick with one finger at a time. But it's unfortunately lost in the motion blur and lives in the final shot. Moving on to the third shot, I thought a top down angle would be best to reveal the wings for the first time. I began with a simple animation of the wings to unfurling, slightly offsetting the animation to make it more realistic. As well as to hide the keyframes, they went in and played the movement curves of each bone to add character to know how they open. Having them get stuck momentarily and each other bump to this made the shot more interesting but also added to the character as the mechanism doesn't work perfectly. It shows that it probably something she made herself. It's also important to the plot don't work how she wants to them to, so there is foreshadowing and information slightly. I wanted the wings to flap in the wind, which I initially tried to simulate with a cloth modifier and wind force, but soon found that making it appear exactly how I wanted wasn't going to happen. So I therefore came up with a solution of using a wave modifier with a displaced modifier instancing from a noise texture to add variation to the flaps. This gave the wings the impression of the flapping in the wind without any simulations. I could also easily control how fast and how violently they would flap. Having watched a video essay earlier in that reference the way the cover of the trees affect the light of the ground, I had decided to add some texture to the light that would make the shot more interesting. So I made the light color made node based and added a few textures with some basic seething animation. I adjusted the size and intensity to look good and made sure that it transitioned into my lighting as well. I then used the similar geometry node tree that I used for the mountains to create the painterly ground on either side of the path. With that rendered, I went back and opened to have simulation on the wings when they opened to dust come off of them, adding more visual interest as well as emphasizing the gleam of the location and vehicle. Moving on to the final shot that I am going to walk about, although there are two more shots in the sequence, but they deserve their own video as they are more complicated. I wanted to achieve two things in this shot. Firstly, I wanted to transition the sunset as I designed the following shot to be a golden hour. And I also needed to show the wings in action. I began again with looking when my music had a cue that I could use. Unfortunately enough, there was a beat heard at the right time, so I could have my character strike a position of the front of the sun. So in Blender, I subdivided and extruded a plane and used the displaced modifier with a noise texture to create mountains. I then used the array modifier to make more, going back and use the displaced modifier again, this time with a gradient texture to make them get higher as they got further away. In retrospect, I could modify the plane with an array modifier, which would have been more simple, but this worked as well. I then used the solidify and subdivided the modifiers into to add depth and the geometry. Then in the shading tab I used the gradient node to change the color as they got further away and the noise texture to add variation to the color of each mountain. I then molded and textured my foreground mountains. I used the sky texture to add a sun that would affect the lighting depending on its location. Once I was happy with the camera angle and position, I animated the sun to drop from the sky and roll between the mountains and landing in place in time with the music. This was an idea that I had in the moment when I was trying to find a good position for the sun in the shot and decided to add it in the shot as an issue of the creatively transitioning to sunset. I then used a curve to get the motion of the bike and animated along the curve, with it slowing down in front of the sun to hit a pause on a beat. I then had it to shoot away quickly as I knew that for the next shot it would be heavily faster. I went in and animated the girl on the bike so she pushes herself off the hill, leans forward, and absorbs the landing. I did the same thing with the wings. I then added some extra lighting between the mountains to give shot more depth and rendered. In composting, I have a general knot tree that adds glow, gray, and line work to the shadows and some lens distortion and blur at the edges. I then go into each individual shot and then change specific things to get it just right. Thank you. For the last shot, however, I also added some lens dirt for which I used a free image of lens dirt and bowed the black background. I then used the lens reflection and glow node with just the glow visible rather than base image as well. I combined these with the screen blending node and then merged them with the lens dirt image with a multiple blending mode, and then layered this on the top of my image sequence with a screen blending mode. It's dirtier up my otherwise very clean image. For the base image sequence, I used a tilt shift blur node to give it that miniature toy. As you can see, the music adds a lot, but that additional sound design is very important. Here it is with just the music and no sound effects. It sounds much more emptier without the sound effects. For this project, I have 45 audio tracks. There are parts of the film where all the are being used at the same time, meaning that you are hearing 45 individual sounds at some point that's it in the film. In this sequence, the maximum you hear is about 20 tracks, which is when the wings are opening. Hopefully this gave you a fairly good idea of how I animated this sequence. I didn't want to get into too much of the detail, but also give an idea of the process when it comes to animating a scene like this. Thanks for watching.